Buenos días, damas y caballeros, distinguidas autoridades.
Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, distinguished authorities and representatives from the energy sector of the region. For logistical purposes, do note that we have simultaneous interpreting available both in English and in Spanish. To access these options, you need to click on the interpreting icon located at the bottom of your screens. There, you can select the language that you want to listen to. On behalf of the Latin American Energy Organization and the Inter-American Development Bank, please be most welcome to the 6th edition of the Energy Week. We want to thank the support of our main sponsors for the 6th edition of the Energy Week, and we also want to thank our strategic and media partners as well. We now start the panel on energy prospects, made up of Roundtable 1 on renewables on water, and Table 2 for post-COVID green recovery. Let us get started with Roundtable 1 for today. The moderator will be Juan Paredes for the IDB. Please, Juan, turn on your microphone and camera so we can begin with this roundtable. If you have any questions, you can click on the Q&A option and ask them over there. Welcome. Thank you, Karina. Good morning, everyone, or afternoon or night, depending on where you are. On behalf of the OLADE and the IDB, we would like to welcome you to this 5th day of the Energy Week and to this roundtable, where we will be talking about renewables on water and new opportunities for decarbonization. Before we begin, as already mentioned, we have simultaneous interpreting available here in the Zoom platform. You can choose a language that you want to listen to.
We have simultaneous translation. So on your Zoom platform, you can go to the word icon at the bottom of your screen and choose the language of your preference. Mi nombre es Juan Paredes.
I am Juan Paredes, and I am a specialist for renewables for the IDB. And in this roundtable today, we want to talk about the progress of new renewable technologies in the sea world. We want to hear about the challenges and lessons learned from those countries that have been trying to implement them. It is a true pleasure to have experts with us today from 5 different countries, especially from countries that have vast experience with these technologies and who are leaders in the application of these technologies, such as the United Kingdom and Germany. And we also have countries that are aspiring to become regional leaders in the application of these technologies, such as the case for Brazil and Costa Rica. In the past few years, significant progress has been made across the world in the implementation of these technologies. They are affordable and diverse in their technologies and offer new opportunities for the decarbonization of our technologies. In the case of marine wind technology, it took 20 years to be able to install 45 gigawatts at the global level. But according to the industry's forecast, we know that the next 45 gigawatts will be achieved in the next 5 years. So this shows clearly that we are now undergoing an accelerated adaptation of this technology. It is a pleasure to be able to be sharing knowledge and lessons learned with everyone here today in order to support the energy transition agendas from our countries. This work perfectly aligns with our 2025 vision that prioritizes climate change and the strengthening of value chains. If we had gotten anything positive out of this pandemic, is that the exploitation of renewables is the most resilient option in this crisis, because as we saw in 2020, it was these energies that they grow in their penetration in the global energy mix. For the agenda today, we will start with a very short presentation that will provide us context about where sea energies are standing, such as the offshore and the floating energy. We will have 2 panels today. The first one will be focused on challenges and lessons learned from countries that have implemented this technology. And the second panel will be more regional and will focus on the needs across the countries that are in development. I want to welcome first Carlos Alvero. He is the director of the biggest consultancy company for renewables at the global level. Carlos will be providing a very brief presentation to contextualize this discussion so we can then move on with the rest of the panelists. Go ahead, Carlos. Thank you for joining us. Thank you, Juan. Thank you to Olade and the IDB for bearing us in mind and for your kind words. As you were mentioning, DNV is one of the biggest independent energy consultancy companies across the world, and we have a very vast track record given the fact that this company has been around for over 157 years. We have over 12,000 employees working in the marine, oil and gas, and renewables context. And we also work on the certification and the insurance of the supply chain. So we work across the entirety of the value chain for the supply of components and technologies and energy projects. Now, with regards to offshore wind, this is a slide that comes from our energy transition outlook that we have just published. We published this about a month ago. And here we share our vision of where we believe the energy world will be by 2050. This is not a report that shows multiple scenarios. We're just sharing our own vision. And there are two spaces where this report is important. First of all, we say that the world energy demand will come to a standstill in the next decade. But on the contrary, what you can see here in the graph, the electrification will increase in the next decade, which is why this graph is moving upwards for renewables, which are the cases that you see here in blue and yellow and orange. So we have floating offshore wind, fixed offshore wind, solar energy. So we have a great increase in offshore and in solar energies. And the reason why we believe that floating offshore wind is one of the biggest alternatives for us is because it will generate around 9% of global electricity by 2050. But for this, the challenge is that we need to have more turbines. We need to have grand scale projects, of course. We need to leverage synergies between projects to facilitate interconnections and operations and maintenance across the value chain. And we need to have a specialized supply chain. So far, offshore, it has been using the onshore supply chain, but we know that the offshore is growing in scale and will need its own dedicated supply chain closer to the ports, closer to those spaces where parks are going to be installed in order to be able to transport those generators. And we believe that we will choose floating wind because we can use the northern wind in the area of Belgium, Holland, and we will deplete those areas. So as of that moment, there are other areas where the work goes beyond 60 or 70 meters. That is now the range where it is feasible at the economic level to install these projects. So by 2050, we believe that we will have a bigger capacity of floating offshore than the one we have today. We have the High Wind Scotland projects. We have the Interline project in UK, and these are pilot projects that will enable us to take a leap towards the Spaniard, French, and Italian shores, and then in Latin America, the Brazilian and the Mexican shores, where these floating devices will be able to find a market. So we do foresee that we will have 255 gigawatts of installed capacity in floating wind. But we will achieve this, of course, and as we will see in the future, is an aggressive cost reduction in the value chain of floating wind. we are close to 75 and 80 megawatts, euros per megawatts. But there is a clear trend for the reduction of these costs in the next few decades. So by 2050, we will be paying about 40 euros megawatts per hour, and that's a very competitive price. However, there is a risk of having floating wind parks, because even if the technology of these generators is tested onshore, including a floating device is more complex, but we can mitigate these risks. And for those of you who have already developed these onshore photovoltaic energies on, you know what the risks are and you know how to mitigate them. We have a technological risk, of course, for the anchor points and the movings and the floating devices, but we can mitigate them through proper technological consultancy. So we need to iterate the design to find the proper design, not just in terms of technology, but also in terms of the project layout, so that the levelized cost of energy of installations is as competitive as possible in order to actually offer competitive energy costs. So for the mitigation, we need to do a market monitoring, we need to do a legal assessment, we need to work with experienced partners, and we need to have proper public participation and engagement. For the construction of the project, we need to deal with reasonable schedules. We need to make sure that we mitigate the risks for gaps within context. We need to forecast the weather properly. So we need to have, of course, work that is conducted with experienced partners. We need to evaluate risks, and we need to transfer risks to those parties that can better manage them.
And in maintenance operations, what we see is that the current trend is that all maintenance costs are going to lower. It's true that they will be more competitive each time, but we have to have clear that what are the means to reduce them and how we can use those synergies. We can do it through a project or also via synergies of technological development in the maintenance phases. That's a very relevant part of the marine floating parks. So let's go to floating solar one now, that it's a bit of a different environment, at least in the beginning. What we are seeing is that there are many existing concepts that are being developed and being tested in reality that are especially in reservoirs and floating in water, where we're having tests. But we're also having floating structures onshore and islands and different types of floating devices. Where's the technical potential? In this table that we have from the ESMA World Bank, we have is just some assumptions regarding the surface where we would use those reservoirs, what we would be using for a potential energy production. And what you see is that in South America, it's around 330 megawatts, using just that, gigawatts, sorry. All of this grows exponentially as we use a bigger fraction of the available reservoirs. And why are we talking about this? Because it's the sweet spot for this type of energy, because they already have the connection, and we can play with that complementing aspect with solar energy and the hydraulic resource in order to be able to manage that energy in the plants using an interconnection system that is already there in place. So you can lower the costs using an existing transformer or the existing infrastructure. So that is a huge advantage. Where's the point for that development? It's actually in a very primal stage. We are talking about 1 to 5 megawatts in South America, less than 200 in Europe, less than 5 in Africa. 2,700 megawatts in Asia. Sometimes it's due to a lack of space, and there could be other alternatives. In South America, we are looking at all the areas where renewables haven't reached yet, but we have natural reservoirs or artificial ones that can be used for this development and that can be interconnected to the network with ease. So as you can see, there is a very big market for this technology. And where are we at regarding costs? If you take a look at these tables very quickly, you can see that most of them are in the structure of the plant, of the photovoltaic plant. We have a structure of cement and steel, and then we have a floating structure. That's where we have to work because it's going to be industrialized, and therefore that gap can be breached. In this graph, the interconnection is very similar, but what we're saying is that we could use some of these points of interconnection that already exist to create a more competitive floating energy system. So this is a transition where we are asked to stick to the agreements of the countries as much as possible, and that is feasible, but we need to have capital towards renewable energies and emerging technologies in order to be able to gain trust and to be able to comply with that and be able to comply with the agreements between the countries. So thank you, Juan. We'll see if there are any questions afterwards. Thank you very much, Carlos. I'm thinking about different things and regarding your presentation. When these technologies go to water, there are different risks that appear. But we have to talk with the people who create these things. And in our first panel, we have a huge experience on this. So I'm going to ask our three guests, Megan Smith, Karina Votz, and Francisco, to activate their cameras to make a quick round of presentations, and then we'll begin with the panel. We have two leading countries in technology, like Germany and England. In the UK, we have Megan Smith. I'm going to switch to English to make presentations.
She's the head of Offshore Wind Advisory of the Carbon Trust in the UK. Megan is primarily focused on the US and Asian markets and was previously involved in the Offshore Wind Accelerator research and development project between the Carbon Trust and 9 leading offshore developers. I also found very interesting from her bio that she helped develop the UK's offshore transmission regime. And we all know that interconnection of offshore facilities is one of the key areas for a successful development of the industry. So I look forward to hearing your experience on how to interconnect these big facilities on the sea. From Germany, we have Karina Wörz. Karina is the managing director of the German Wind Energy Foundation. She's been in that role since August 2021. Before that, she worked for one of the largest power utilities in Germany, RWE, and she helped develop its offshore wind business. I guess not so many people can say in their curriculum that they were the general manager for a 300 megawatt offshore wind energy facility, but she can tell that. So I look forward as well to your experience managing an offshore wind facility. And we have from IRENA, the International Renewable Energy Agency, Francisco Buchel, who is a markets and standards analyst for renewable energy technologies. He has provided policy advice and guidance to countries on technology innovation, quality control, and standardization for the successful deployment of renewable energy, and has co-authored reports on energy transition and technologies, including offshore wind, advanced biofuels, electric vehicles, and mini-grids. So after that short introduction, I want to start the conversation. Thank you so much for being with us today. I'm going to start with Megan. Megan, you are from the UK. The UK is the leader at the moment. This is a very dynamic race. but the UK has the highest installed capacity in offshore wind. If you can correct me if I'm wrong, but I guess it's above 10 gigawatts right now. So the simple short question is, how did you manage it? How did you manage to build that large capacity in the sea? But in general, I would like to have your thoughts on which are the success factors in the implementation of this technology, and what advice could you give to developing countries considering the risk that we just heard about? Where do governments need to pay more attention? So I appreciate your thoughts on things, and thank you so much for being here.
No worries. Thank you for having me. I think the UK is potentially about to be overtaken by China in installed capacity, but I think we might still just have the edge. Still, I think we're proud of what we've done, and certainly the industry is going to be continuing to grow in the UK, and that's certainly expected. I think in terms of the sort of key success factors of how the UK has achieved it, I think there are kind of three main areas that really contributed to that. The first was the kind of long-term view from policymakers. The support for offshore wind remained consistent despite multiple governments. The industry really takes a very long time to build, and having that consistency of sort of political support was really key in building the confidence in the industry, getting industry to invest in the supply chain, the infrastructure, and also lowering the risk, because the financing cost is a huge part of this. So if it's seen as a safe investment, as something that does have a long-term viability, then the risk will come down as well. So I think that long-term view is really key. The second area that I think is really important is having competition to drive the cost down and therefore increase the market, but it's got to be done in the right way. And I think in the UK, in the early stages of the industry, we did not have competitive subsidy regimes. It was just a fixed subsidy regime, which again built that confidence. Once the industry was up and running and a bit more mature, we then switched to a competitive subsidy regime, which then forced the price down. So there's often a kind of trade-off between industry growth, which is essential for eventually pushing costs down, but then also the kind of forcing costs down to the expense of increasing the risk to potential investors. So competition is key, but it needs to be competition done in the right way. And then I think the third really important point is collaboration. And what we've seen in the UK and across Europe is a huge amount of collaboration between offshore wind developers to really get the industry as a whole a competitive energy source. You mentioned in my introduction, one of the programs that we run at Carbon Trust is the Offshore Wind Accelerator, and that's taken about £30 million public funding and has reduced the cost of offshore wind in Europe by over £34 billion through this kind of collaborative research and development approach. So I think having that kind of support to catalyze those kind of collaboration programs where industry could work together to make sure that the offshore wind is as a larger market as it can possibly be is a really effective way, and has shown to be a really effective way of catalyzing the market and really driving costs down as well. So I think those are the sort of three main areas that come to mind and the success factors.
Thank you so much, Megan. Very, very good insights. Those three conditions: the long-term view, the competition, and the collaboration. I think as well those are key. So let's go ahead with Karina. Karina, you have been working in this field for many years. I would like to hear your thoughts on what is needed to have a successful implementation of the technology, in this case in Germany.
Yeah, thank you very much. It's all my pleasure to be here and be able to speak to you today. I can only support what Megan just said. In my past career, I've been working very closely together with offshore projects in the UK, and there has been a close collaboration regime also between Germany and the UK that has certainly helped. Germany is not as far developed in terms of offshore wind installed capacity as the UK is. We have currently 7.8 gigawatt installed in the German seas, and we do have a complete interruption of installation activities since last year that has also endured during the whole year of 2021, very regretfully, and basically lack to a consistency of political support. So basically what Megan just said, what is so vitally important for an offshore supply chain, for developers, for banks, financial institutions, for insurance companies, all the likes. If there is a lack in political support due to election regimes whatsoever, a change in governments, that can be deadly to offshore wind installation activities in a country. What I can definitely say that is you need to establish a reliable offshore wind pipeline, so an installation target pipeline at best per year, to give private companies planning security and to attract the needed funding from the finance sector and also from the insurance market. Never underestimate the insurance market. It's quite a large risk that they have to underwrite for any given offshore wind farm. And you do not get project funding if you do not have the insurance backing in the back. The second point that also Megan pointed out was a subsidy regime. Definitely it helps to have a subsidy regime at the beginning of a growing market, which is not so much based on lowest possible cost, but perhaps more on developing a completely new technology in a country. We had a fixed feed-in tariff in Germany for years, and we are now in a transition phase from the fixed feed-in tariff to auctioning, which definitely has already contributed to significantly lowered pricing in terms of cost for offshore wind. Then, as a third point, Megan, you mentioned collaboration. I can totally underline that, so I totally agree. In Germany, it has definitely helped that since 2005, we had a public foundation that helped to do institution building and also networking between existing institutions and existing authorities, which perhaps were responsible for something but were not used to speak to each other. And so this is a foundation that I'm now heading, and this foundation helped significantly to establish the necessary ties and network exchange possibilities between various authorities, and also between authorities and the private sector. For example, we established quite a few working groups between interested stakeholders for grid connection, for the exchange between the maritime sector and offshore wind operators, a project group regarding HSE requirements, and so on and so forth. So definitely help to catalyze the market and to catalyze also sort of the bureaucracy behind it. As a fourth and fifth point, I would just like to add that it is definitely helpful to invest early enough in harbor infrastructure, which means quayside, storage space, and so on. Do not underestimate the loads that need to be loaded onto the quaysides, and never underestimate onshore grid connection in terms of the land conflicts that you might incur, in terms of the permitting process, the lengthiness of the whole process to get additional grid connection in place in order to be able to transfer the offshore generated electricity into the onshore grid. So that's me. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Karina. Veo que hay coincidencias en cuáles son.
Thank you very much. I can see that there are coincidences in terms of what are the necessary conditions for a successful implementation in the creation of a pipeline and a project portfolio, getting public subsidy and public support. And I think what you were mentioning about not underestimating the needs for infrastructure, for the interconnection and for the management of these infrastructures is also paramount. Let us go to Francisco now from IRENA. Francisco, as we've been hearing from the other panelists, there is significant support from governments in order to start deploying these technologies in their early stages. So you always look at the global picture and you provide consultancy for government. So what is your perspective on this leap that countries need to take when sometimes they do not have all the necessary economic and financial resources? So what are the things we need to do to convince these countries that are in development that this technology is worth the time and the hassle? Well, thank you for the question. I would say that I fully agree with what Megan and Karina were mentioning, but there are some things that I believe are worth noting. One thing is that we know that the marine wind market is mostly focused in Europe. Europe has been at the forefront of the development of these technologies, and it has the most installed capacity. But we want this to also move to other emerging economies, such as Asia Pacific, but also countries in Latin America, for example, Brazil and Colombia. But the acceleration of the development of these technologies needs to be steadfast if we want to meet our energy transition goals. We're talking about 40 gigawatts of installed right now, but we need over 400 by 2030 and over 2,000 by 2050. So we should be installing around 70 gigawatts every year from now all the way up to 2050 if we want to meet our goals. But we do see a great political effort to meet these goals. As a matter of fact, the task of the G20 was to develop an action plan in order to promote wind marine energy across the world. And it provided a roadmap and recommendations. But so it's clear that the G20 is pushing for this. We have heard from many countries that they want to have a collaboration platform for the exchange of good regulations and practices between countries. We will also be having a meeting in Denmark as well. And we will look at a new initiative called the Offshore Wind Accelerators that tries to see how these emerging economies can start developing these technologies. But going back to political incentives in particular, what we see is that when these technologies are at their early stages, we have these premium costs. We have the cost of difference, and now we are starting to move to offshoring, which increases competitivity, as Megan was saying. But what countries need to bear in mind are the differences between these kind of auctions. In Europe, what we have seen are variations in auctions between countries, between 20 and 100 euros per megawatt per hour. And that depends on how these auctions are designed and whether or not they bear in mind the cost of the ultra-maritime connection, the cost of the area, if we're considering inflation. So it is good to learn from the experiences of different auction designs for these technologies. So that's my first message. Then we need to get intra-regional and interregional collaboration. And that's the only place where we see that is Europe. That kind of collaboration is not existent in Latin America or in Asia. So there's a long way ahead for us, because in Europe, we see that that's the only region where the countries are collaborating in these matters. But we also need to have intersector collaborations, because we don't want people to come in and do whatever they want. The sea, of course, is full of economic activities, and we need to consider maritime spatial planning, and we need to consider the governance of the sea that is also ruled by international agreements. So we need those governments that are interested in offshore wind to sit at the round table with other stakeholders that are interested in this economy. For example, in its maritime special planning, Belgium said in 2015 that 7% of their maritime space will be devoted to offshore wind, and that's an example of what we can do in other countries. And the third thing is to go back to what Karina was saying about infrastructure. Infrastructure is vital for us, and we need to remember that value chains in ultramaritime energy comes from renewables. And for the ultramaritime wind energy, we need to have dedicated technology. So for those countries that have experience in ultramaritime oil, as is the case of Norway and other European countries, we can start taking experience from them. We know that in Latin America, there are other countries that have experience in that offshore oil energy, so they can redirect their techniques, their skills, and their experiences into this new sector that can create more economic activities and more job positions. We can use the ports, we can use the ships and the vessels that are used for that kind of energy, so we can redirect experiences from the Latin American region into this new economic area. So those would be the points that I wanted to raise. Okay, thank you, Francisco. Those were very valuable points that you brought up, especially with the case of synergies with existent industries such as the gas and oil industries. And also, you brought up the need to collaborate with other regions as with Europe. I would like now to move into a second round of questions. Please take 1 or 2 minutes to answer these questions, by the way, so then we can move into the next panel. So I want to ask you about the risks that you see in the initiation of these projects. What is the biggest risk in comparison to, for example, onshore wind energy, and how could we mitigate these risks? Karina was telling us about insurance and the need to have insurance. How are you mitigating these possible risks in Germany? And in general, what would be the biggest risk that you see ahead? So,
yeah, happy to elaborate a bit on that. So just in terms of financial investment risk, offshore wind is just so much bigger than onshore. So you can just add between 1 and 3 zeros for everything that you do in offshore in comparison to onshore wind. May it be in terms of installed capacity, in terms of investment needed, and so on and so forth. So the larger the capacity that you install, the largest investment you need, and hence, for example, contractual liabilities and interface risks increase accordingly. For example, take, just as an example, a delayed grid connection. That was a huge topic in Germany, where the grid connection offshore was in the contractual scope of the grid connectors, of the grid operators, whilst building the offshore wind farm as such was in the risk sphere of investors or project developers or operators later on. So delay in startup insurance is something that the insurance market then offers you as a product. Very useful when you have a financial project, when you have a banking finance in your project, if you cannot invest out of pure equity, but also enormously expensive. Then with much capacity and high capacity factors, you also generate much more electricity than with a comparable onshore wind farm. So you also run into risk that the onshore grid as such is not able to cope with all that sudden offshore electricity that comes into the onshore grid. And that has been definitely an experience made in Germany, that offshore wind farms got curtailed, so got sort of steered down, drove down because of lack of transmission capacity in the net. You might know that we have a large, still regrettably, we do still have a large coal-fired power plant base in Germany and also nuclear. That sort of, fills the grid to a certain extent. And when you then have high winds and perhaps also high and sunny days, not so often in Germany, but can happen, then the grid is suddenly absolutely full, and transmission capacities are just being brought down, and hence offshore wind farms simply cannot generate. In that regard, grid connect or grid development onshore goes hand in hand also with grid connection offshore and also internationally. So in Europe, we now just get started with signing agreements. Just as we speak, there has been a major signature of inter-European grid connection agreements between, for example, I think Germany and Denmark, and also another one, I think, between the UK and Denmark. So there's a lot of activity going on, but it took us 20 years to get to that point. Not necessarily you need to take the same lengthy route to that acknowledgement that grid connection, international grid connection offshore makes a lot of sense. Then coming to risks of offshore construction and operation. So in my former role as a general manager of an offshore wind farm of the earlier generation, I've seen sort of everything that could possibly go wrong. And there's a lot of lessons learned in the market by now. And I think that there are a lot of possibilities to benefit from that if you find the right sources. So we're certainly happy to share what we have, and also to make other countries take profit from what should perhaps be avoided. Offshore construction and operation is way more complex and complicated than onshore operation. For example, due to limited access, being in terms of weather, wave height, and so on and so forth. And normally you also have remote operation sites for offshore. So you need to establish rather complex shift pattern regimes. So Germany, we have 14 days on, 14 days off regimes. Doesn't make it overly easy also with the unions. Then we certainly do have, and I saw that, I think, in the comments sites here, we do have conflicts for land. So multi-use patterns, multi-use ideas, to just allow multiple stakeholders to take use of the offshore sites. For example, to allow also the local fishery industry to take profit from what certainly can be defined as a very positive effect on subsea sea life in terms of the structures. When the structures are constructed into the seabed, they into very short periods of time frames, they get that thickness of mussels on them, and then you can see that the whole sea life just follows up, and there are certainly possibilities that you find ways to coexist with other stakeholders, like, for example, the fisheries. And then finally, but not least, but certainly not least important, is HSE risk. So you have the three factors that every HSE person hates, which is large height, large deepness, and large load factors. So everything that I can recommend in that regard is invest in offshore rescue. That's it.
Thank you, Karina. Very important insights about the risk. We are running out of time. So Megan, I will ask you in 1 minute, what is the top risk for you?
I think there's so many. I think maybe to switch it around, the question of like what are the risks of onshore versus offshore. I would say that there is really quite limited similarities between onshore and offshore. Offshore, as Karina has said, is just so different in terms of scale, in terms of logistics, in terms of risk and grid integration. But I think for me, the number one for risk for a successful large-scale offshore deployment is grid connections and sort of system integration.
Thank you so much, Megan. Yeah, that's key. The long-term planning, it's fundamental to achieve successful offshore integration. Thank you so much, Karina, Francisco, and Megan. We wanted to invite to the conversation some key players in our region, in Latin America. Now I'm going to switch to Spanish. Vamos con el segundo panel.
I will switch now into Spanish. Let us move into the second panel very quickly. We have Dr. Rodrigo Rojas. Rodrigo is a researcher in the Costa Rica Research Center. Since 2013, he has been leading actions to integrate this maritime energy in Costa Rica. He was a coordinator in the Maritime Conference, and he led the roadmap for maritime wind, maritime energy. We also have Tiago Barral. Tiago Barral is the executive president of the EPE, or Energy Research Office in Brazil. He is responsible for the planning for the sector in Brazil. And we also have Joyce Lee. Joyce Lee
She's the head of policy and prospects and projects at the Global Wind Energy Council, an industry association representing the wind energy industry in emerging markets worldwide. At GWEC, she's responsible for articulating the policy positions for the global wind energy industry within international institutions. Bienvenidos, les pediría el favor de conectar sus cámaras a Joyce, a Tiago y a Rodrigo.
Welcome everyone, please turn on your cameras and microphones. I will start with Tiago. I would like to know what's the motivation of your countries to explore these wind energies, and what is the progress that you have made in terms of regulations, and what are the roadblocks that you have come across? So Tiago, you have the floor. Thank you, Juan. I think I will speak in English. Yeah, no problem. Go ahead.
First of all, thank you for having me at the Energy Week. But I would start by saying, Juan, that to reach GDP per capita in Brazil equivalent to what UK is today, Brazil will need to triple electricity supply by 2050. And so when we were developing our 2050 energy plan, we realized that it's really strategic to prepare the ground for additional resources to be available in the country. The main driver, so, is diversification, technology diversification, geographical diversification, complementarity with of generation profiles, and the expected outcome by doing that is to increase energy security, energy resilience, and also increase competitive forces into the market. we can see a lot of potential also when we were studying the role of offshore wind and floating PV, a great potential for optimizing the transmission grid topology and use. And that's because of the complementarity of wind and solar with hydropower, the baseload generation in Brazil, and also because most of renewables in Brazil today are concentrated in the northeast of the country, while demand is concentrated in the southeast. So competitive offshore wind and floating PV potential is likely to be spread geographically, and that's a bonus for those technologies. The main barrier today, Juan, is no surprise cost and the need for some sort of subsidy mandates or technology-specific auctions in Brazil. And particularly when there is an existing pipeline of renewable energy projects in the country of more than 120 gigawatts of onshore wind and solar that have already asked for access to the grid. So these are the main, I would say, starting points for discussing the role and the benefits. Just very briefly, having said that, I'd like to mention some positive data. The Federal Environmental Agency in Brazil has received already 23 project submissions of offshore wind that sum up to 45 gigawatt of capacity. These are not all mature projects, but show that the market is moving ahead. And when it comes to floating PV, we have some pilot and demonstration projects, including the 2.5 megawatt floating PV in Sobradinho Reservoir and 2.5 megawatt in Balbina Reservoir, and at least other 12 smaller installations of floating PV. So back to you, Juan. I hope that's a first starting point for our discussion.
Sí, muchas gracias, Thiago. Muy interesante.
Yes, thank you, Thiago. I find the Brazilian interest in these projects to be most essential. And you mentioned the need for complementary work. I understand that about 30% of the population of Brazil lives near the coast, which is why this offshore wind energy has a higher impact on production, and it's closer to consumers. So that will be important for Brazil. I want to go now to Rodrigo. Welcome, Rodrigo. It is a joy to have you with us here today. I want to know in a couple of minutes what you have been doing in Costa Rica in this area. What is your perspective on the technology, and what are the roadblocks that you've come across? Well, thank you. Good morning. I want to know if you can see my screen. Yes, we can see it. Well, on behalf of the Costa Rica Electricity Institute, thank you for inviting me. In order to better use my time, I want to briefly share a message through a couple of slides. The first thing that I want to share is Costa Rica's position pertaining to the development of offshore energies. This is important for this panel because Costa Rica, ever since 2013, has been showing an interest in using the offshore resource available to us, not just on the Pacific coast, but also on the Caribbean coast as well. So that is why since 2013, using IDB funds, we were able to develop our first research that enabled us to understand the distribution of energy potentials for sea currents and wind currents. That gave us an opportunity to share with decision makers in the country that Costa Rica, in the same way that had led a 100% renewable mix in the region, and that's something that we proudly say, has significant potential for the development of maritime energy as well. From then onwards, in 2018, we were able to carry out the first research in order to find offshore energy potential. And the main results of this research showed that we have a room for opportunity for wind development in the Northern Pacific. With regards to wind speed, it is steady every day of the year, and this shows us that we have 14.4 gigawatts of opportunity to develop wind projects offshore in Costa Rica. From then onwards, we wanted to establish the possibility of developing in technical, social, and environmental terms these energy potentials, recognizing, of course, the natural conditions and the energy dynamics of our country, both in terms of offer and demand. By 2020, we hit a significant landmark, and that's that our country was selected for the development of the first global maritime conference in Latin America. 25 countries participated in this conference. We had companies from the private sector participating. Over 250 global experts shared in Costa Rica their experience and showed what we were doing in Latin America.
The moment that we are in relationship with the development on the aspirations of a energy mix in the sea, we are really taking significant steps. And in 2021, as you can see, COVID-19 was really a point that changed things and was very important to take into account the dynamic and in terms of investigation, research, and development. So 2020 and 2021 were years in which Costa Rica was able to develop the wind project. In this case, really focused to a geographical area. We are working on the north area. In this area, we were able to determine that there is a potential for wind technology for aeolic in the bottom, and there is a potential for around 540 megawatts. Recently, when the Energy Council, we were able to determine the beginning of the first roadmap that positions important milestones regarding the aspirations of Costa Rica and the region related to energy, in this case offshore. But I would also like to talk about some other details with you, and it's that what's our roadmap for the mid and the long term between 2021 and 2028. 2028, of course, we have to respect the principle of reality. That is that at least in the case of Costa Rica, the pandemic evidently caused a rupture in the consumption of electric energy in the country. And there is the demand was reduced, and there is an offer of energy that is going to be maintained several years. It's very important to keep this in mind, since these are the conditions of the country to be able to continue to generate the conditions that will allow in the midterm to aspire for Costa Rica to insert energy that comes from the ocean. We cannot do anything but think that we have a great opportunity. And rather than seeing something negative in the juncture of COVID, we are seeing it as a very high possibility, as a fresh air, that it's giving us time to plan ahead and see what the development agenda of the future will be like for the hydroelectric energy. And with this vision, where are we? What are we focusing on? So there is a great incidence in development of energy, marine energy, And this is going to really be important for the decarbonization plan of the nation. And this will happen in the following years. Also, with this, we'll have the possibility of starting to develop the conditions that will allow us to conduct research on productivity and also on the legal framework, the fees structure, acceptance, different meta-ocean research. And in the long term, evidently, there will be the possibility of developing projects and being able to bring to reality different projects that are related to the usage of hydroelectric energy. This is the most important message that we want to share. Thank you very much, Rodrigo. That was very complete and very organized, the whole overview of Costa Rica. It's great to listen and see all of the potential that it has.
You just heard there is 45 gigawatts in projects in Brazil, 40 gigawatt potential for marine energies for offshore in Costa Rica. So the potential is there. Collaboration is key. How is GWIC helping the developing countries to achieve that?
Thank you so much, Juan, for this question and for inviting me to this discussion. I mean, I think clearly the ambition and the enthusiasm for offshore wind is present on this panel with our friends from Brazil and Costa Rica. And I think the list of countries that are excited about offshore wind and interested to learn more about system integration and how this can help meet their national energy security and climate goals goes far beyond those two countries, goes even beyond the Latin America region. And we're really starting to see the sector start to expand beyond its kind of legacy markets of the UK, China, and Europe, which is home to the 35 gigawatts of offshore wind that we have installed around the world today. You mentioned the dynamic race between the UK and China before. It looks like China is going to pull ahead by the end of this year, and they're on track to install around 7 gigawatts of offshore winds alone, just because of the expiration of their offshore wind feed-in tariff. But this is a race to the top that I think we can all support. So I think first to note that GWEC has observed a number of factors which are responsible for motivating this increased interest in offshore wind, and that new entrants to the offshore wind sector can start to benefit from these factors. Some of them have been mentioned before. So we have this dramatic cost reduction, where in LCOE terms for global weighted average cost for fixed bottom offshore wind, we've already seen declines of costs by around 2/3 over the last decade. That's largely due to operational efficiencies, equipment improvements, technological excellence, higher capacity factors, improved installation and O&M as well, developer experience, which helps to shorten installation times, and that also helps to drive down CapEx for project developers. You have auction schemes, which are encouraging pricing discovery and competition, which Megan spoke about, as well as supply chain consolidation, which helps to improve pricing efficiencies. And then finally, as the sector continues to mature, you'll have reduced investor risk, which means lower cost of financing accessible for project developers. So all those factors on top of our broader climate and energy security goals have really formed the bedrock of growth, and why we're seeing more and more countries, and importantly, sub-national authorities. It's not just the national governments that are excited about offshore wind. Often it's the provincial or the state authorities that are kind of leading the way first, because they recognize the inward capital investment and job creation benefits that come with the sector's development. How is GWEC engaging in those markets where interest has been raised? So we help to negotiate around some of the common market barriers, and we like to look at what lessons have been learned in the mature offshore wind markets, and sometimes onshore wind sector, or even similar kind of large-scale infrastructural sectors. Offshore oil and gas can also yield helpful lessons for what could be imported to offshore wind to accelerate development. And I'll speak a little bit about the common barriers that we are seeing now in one of the regions, which is expanding extremely quickly in the sector, which is the Asia Pacific region. And I'll name 3 barriers, which I think will be reflected across most new markets. So the first one is around permitting and consenting for offshore wind. In Vietnam, which does look like it will raise its 2030 target for offshore wind after it committed to net zero by 2050 at COP26. In Vietnam, permitting can be incredibly complex. You need dozens of different licenses and consents from national authorities, provincial people's committees, and local authorities. And all of this, when you're looking at meeting a very tight offshore wind goal within a tight timeline, can slow down deployment. In Korea, which has set a very ambitious target of 12 gigawatts by 2030, the dialogue and the coordination with commercial fishing groups can be complex and slow down the development process due to the prospect of legal opposition or even just community opposition to projects going forward. And here, where there are markets with significant presence of commercial fishing industries, this requires very careful public-private coordination because, of course, the risk of opposition and slowing down deployment can increase investor risk and increase the uncertainty for project development timelines. Another common barrier, which Tiago helpfully mentioned, is cost in new markets for offshore wind, because of course that cost reduction is on a global weighted average term. It's looking at fixed bottom only, not floating, and it is focused mostly on these mature or maturing offshore wind markets. So where this has been mitigated in a new market is in the case of Japan, for example, through a similar setup that was used in the UK under what they called a sector deal for offshore wind. So there were a few different consultancies and think tanks that came together to look at a cost reduction pathway and supply chain growth analysis under the premise that if government were to commit to a high volume of capacity that it could allocate, what sort of cost reduction would industry be able to deliver? And accompanying that, how could it increase the industrialization and the local embedding of content production for offshore wind? And that pathway went out to 2030 and then 2040 and resulted in one of the highest national capacity targets set to date, which is up to 45 gigawatts by 2040, which Japan set in December last year, as well as an agreed cost reduction level by 2035 of around 7 to 8 Japanese yen per kilowatt hour. That was the same kind of government industry premise and deal which was struck in the UK and has resulted in the success of that market that we're seeing today. The third barrier is simply, and this is very much reflected in Rodrigo's discussion as well, a scientific understanding of what is the technical resource within a country's national exclusive economic zone to leverage. And I'll point out here that GWEC and the World Bank have created a library of technical resource maps which show that fixed and floating offshore wind potential for nearly 100 countries. It's available free. Each country map can be downloaded on the GWEC website. But that is a fairly one or two dimensional picture of technical resource. What you'll then need to do is to drill down several levels deeper and commission studies for detailed site-specific wind measurements, for bathymetry and seabed analysis, for marine biodiversity, and then how all these factors are going to interact with factors like marine protected areas, navigation pathways for shipping, tourism zones, which are very key in Latin America, and other so-called no-go areas within EEZs. So I would say those three market barriers are quite common in the sector, and this is where GWEC is helping to facilitate cooperation.
Muchas gracias, Joyce. Muy interesante esos ejemplos.
Thank you very much, Joyce. Those examples from other areas are very interesting. The Japan experience is very interesting. I think that we should not just wait for the technology to lower costs. There are different things that have to do with the premium and the risk of the countries, and quantifying other types of risks, and those could also diminish with these actions in the long term politically. And to generate a pipeline, there are different steps that can be taken to lower that cost. I would like to ask something, one final question to Rodrigo and and Thiago, we've seen that there is a potential, there is that costs are really lowering. So what would be the critical points where organizations such as be OLADE can, the IDB and OLADE can really collaborate for this leap to happen, to adopt these technologies in an accelerated way? So we've already listened to the recommendations of the countries that have already advanced in this topic. Which would be for you one or two critical points in which we could help you overcome these barriers? So let's begin with Thiago. So Juan,
it's really important to have support for private sector to, really, I would say, to support project development will be for sure one of the most important contributions. And why do I say that? For any policy towards fostering offshore wind and floating PV, having a good number of well-developed feasibility and environmental studies will be critical. If we have very few projects being developed, being studied, then it's very hard for policy to really have an impact. So having good projects and a good number of projects being developed and well developed will be critical for any successful policy in this way. And I think having insights for covering regulatory gaps is also a very important contribution. And I think IDB and a number of other institutions have been very helpful in that. I also think that if project developers and policymakers have a strong support from development and multilateral banks to better understand the bankability gaps, will be more effective and more fastly addressing these gaps. And finally, I think we will need to discuss and have support in assessing industrial and supply chain opportunities and risks, and having these institutions helping identify how countries can at least develop part of the supply chain domestically is something very important when discussing and shaping policy towards offshore wind and floating PV. So that's my contribution for now. Thank you.
Muchas gracias, Thiago. Muy importante ese último punto de
Thank you, Thiago. It is obviously important to develop this value chain, especially in the offshore wind power, because the percentage of costs is higher than for onshore energy. So this is also an opportunity for emerging economies to create more jobs. Rodrigo, what would your two critical recommendations be for the governments? Well, what I would say is that there are certain aspects for which we believe that international multilateral banks should look to us. First is that we have a series of conditions that enable us to develop these projects. We know where the resources are. We know what are the technologies that we might use in order to make the best out of these resources. Now, in terms of what we could ask of these multilateral investors is that we need a baseline support. We need to improve the knowledge that we have by improving the LiDAR, the buoy, and the satellite systems that will enable us to improve what we know about this. And we also need to work on capacity buildings. We need to draw attention to this region in order to develop a school for maritime engineers. We need specialists that can deal with the entirety of the supply chain for us to take advantage of the entirety of the sea resource. So if we had to ask help of third parties, we definitely need to include all of this. It is important for us to recognize all the different roles played by many sectors for tourism, for transport, for maritime habitats. And we need to understand how maritime energy plays a role within land planning as well. So I would say that those are the gaps that we are facing for the development of this energy in the midterm in Costa Rica, Juan. Thank you, Rodrigo. It is fundamental to work on capacity building, of course. And over here, we have three very important institutions here that also will work with that. I am doing this on purpose, by the way. I know that they're listening to us, and I know that they should hear this. Costa Rica has so many features and so many resources, and we have taken significant steps, but we require support and backing from multilateral funding sector in order to continue decarbonizing not just the Costa Rica mix, but also to provide support for the entire region. Yes, thank you for that.
Sure, I think the translation might have been delayed.
We have, it seems that we have a homework to improve the capacity, work with universities, create this a data for well, you talk about what you did with the World Bank as well, and it's a very good tool. So I think there is a lot to do. We can stay here talking about all the things that need to be done, but the short-term low-hanging fruits.
Sure, low-hanging fruits, I think, for what multilaterals and development banks and development agencies can bring to this is evidence. I think they can help to reinforce, for offshore wind specifically, that it can be a national priority, moving offshore wind out of the conversation of just being a concern of the Ministry of Energy into ministries of economy, ministries of planning and investment, making sure that these projects, which are bring in billions of capex, have asset lifetimes of 25 years or more, large-scale infrastructure projects can be classed as critical infrastructure because they come with all sorts of benefits that have already been relayed around job creation, economies of scale. All those kinds of evidence can be brought through by reports, economic impact studies, social impact studies. On top of that, grid and infrastructure reinforcement. This is another area which we need to start planning kind of yesterday when we look at our 10-year goals for offshore wind by the end of this decade. It's never too soon to start looking at this. And I think as areas which require large amounts of capital, large amounts of expertise, as well as significant coordination across government ministries, this is where multilaterals and development agencies are well placed to start coordination.
Thank you so much, Joyce. Muchas gracias a nuestros.
Thank you very much, Joyce, and thank you very much to all of our panelists. Rodrigo, Tiago, Joyce, thank you. We ran out of time. Actually, we went over time, but this was a very productive conversation. It was great to hear the experiences from all of your countries, and hopefully we were able to pique your interest in this technology. It was a true pleasure to moderate this section. Thank you to all the panelists, and hopefully I will be able to see you again. Have a lovely day. Let's go to the second round table of the day. Thank you. Go ahead, Karina.
Karina, ¿me escuchas? Estás con el micrófono. Juan, por favor, el video.
Bienvenidos a todos. Damos paso a la
Welcome,
mesa.
everyone. We'll begin with the second roundtable on green recovery after COVID and its perspectives. The moderator in this case will be Gonzalo Bravo of the Bariloche Foundation, who will request to activate his microphone and camera to begin the same. Well, thank you very much, Karina. And they're telling me that you can hear me well, so it's a pleasure to be here in the 6th week, energy week of OLADE and our regional week of energy. And it's really very satisfactory to see how the most important topics are discussed every year with a focus of many stakeholders. That is what we have in the panel. So it's a pleasure for the Bariloche Foundation, represented by myself, to moderate the panel. The idea is to talk a little and try to listen to the panelists with a perspective that
in Spanish, the rest of the panel, because the panelists themselves they speak Spanish and understand the language, and because we are in the region, and it's interesting to have the chance of listening straight our language. Entonces, luego de expresar esta satisfacción, ¿qué es lo que tenemos por delante?
after this, expressing my satisfaction, what do we have ahead of us? We have a very diverse panel with a topic that could be introductory, which is the need for a environmentally friendly approach of renewable energy, and that is sustainable for this crisis of the pandemic, that is an opportunity and a challenge, and we've heard it a lot this week. So this roundtable that could be actually an introduction is a moment to look ahead to the future with perspectives. We're going to have this estimation, this risk of seeing what the future could look like with a critical element of what is going on, especially with the finances. So that is the context, and we invite to discuss this challenge and to identify the main elements for the region to move forward, and what are the elements that we need to pay special attention to, such as investments, need for additional research, joining efforts, clarifying regulation, views and packages of policies to proceed. So I'm going to have each panelist make an introduction of themselves, just to make it more dynamic. I know that it's pretty boring for another person to talk about your what you've done. So let's have first Blandine Barreau. Excuse me if I've mispronounced it. It's the lady who has dared to be a part of this panel that is comprised mostly of men. So regarding this recovery, Blandine, the screen is yours. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. Sorry, Gonzalo, should we just introduce ourselves, or do you want me to start with a presentation? So it's both things. So just a brief introduction, whatever you want to tell us, and then you can proceed with the presentation. So it's both things together to make it a bit more dynamic, so that we have some time at the end to make a summary of the elements that were presented. Okay, perfect. Thank you. So I'm going to put a presentation on screen. So first, you will have to have some patience with me with my Spanish, that I haven't practiced it in a while, and also with the slides that you'll see on screen. So while I'm doing that, I want to say hi to everyone. My name is Blandine, and I'm an analyst in the International Agency of Energy, where I work on the topic of sustainability, and I'm really happy to be a part of this panel today. So we should be starting here with the presentation. Can you see it there on screen? Yes, we can see it. Perfect. Thank you. So thank you again for the possibility of presenting the work of the agency. This is part, and it's an honor to be a part of this interesting panel. I'm going to focus my presentation today on two topics. The first one is the recommendations of the agency on what should be done in terms of public action to recover it sustainably. And secondly, we will talk a bit about an analysis of what exists, what the governments are doing in the framework of their recovery plans. So in June of 2020, when most of the world was in quarantine, the agency published a sustainable recovery plan, and it's part of an investment of the energy in the energy sector and affiliated sectors such as transport of around $3 billion. And the idea is to generate jobs while also diminishing the carbon emissions in line with the Paris Agreement, and always reinforcing the energy sector in the framework of the climate change, of course. The annual investment is 1 million, and the idea here is that the public part of this plan is only 30% of the total. So in the end, we have this plan which could look like a good deal for many governments. And to talk a bit more about this plan of June 2020, I would also like to say that it covers 6 key sectors: electricity, lower emissions, energy efficiency in buildings and the industrial sector, sustainable fuels such as hydrogen and green fuels, and technological innovation. And with all of these pillars, so sorry to interrupt, but could you make the presentation bigger, because we're not seeing it on screen? Thank you very much, Blandine. It's just to put it on full screen, but it's working on. Okay, let me do it again. Maybe if you are sharing 2 screens, that could be the issue. Let's see. Is it better or? So there we have the presentation, but it's not on full screen. I think maybe I'll do it this way. Can you see it better that way? Thank you for your patience. So here we have our recovery plan. Now, about this, the Italian president asked us to create a sustainable recovery tracker, which analyzes in detail what the governments are doing with the recovery measures related to the current crisis. So we have analyzed the content of more than 800 public measures and measured the impact of the energy transition. And what we see with this tracker is that until the end of October, of the $17 million that the government invested in terms of exceptional measures to face the crisis, only 470,000 million were dedicated to clean energies and these 6 measures that I just mentioned. So, Blandine, sorry, but we're not seeing the second one. We're just seeing the first slide, and you're talking about numbers. So, okay, can you see it better now? Thank you. So just to clarify, this first appraisal, I just wanted to say that these figures don't take into account the infrastructure plan of the United States that would add a lot to the total. So the next slide, just to be sure, can you see it? No, so we're not seeing the other slide. Now, yes, we can see it. Now, when we compare annual figures from 2021 to 2023 and taking into account the total investment, not just the government, so including public and private investments, we can see that the recovery measures represent 40% of what has been advised by the Sustainable Recovery Plan, which is not bad, but when we look at it with more details, we see that we are lacking some things in the focus. So talking about focus and taking a look at further details, and even if there are investments that have been attracted by the governments, we see that there are big differences between them. In a general way, the focus of the governments has been in sectors where there were already support plans, such as, for example, energy efficiency, building different transport systems, providing support for electric vehicles. We see that this strategy doesn't always give us the expected results, because in the end, I hope that you can see it on screen, but when we take into account the total investments, we see that the sectors that mobilize the most investments are the private sector, are the ones in which the private sector was already dominating. There is a very clear example, for example, with renewable energies. So that's the global status. If we take a look at Latin America and Central America, we see that governments have focused mainly on 3 topics. First one is electricity, and also, for example, in the recovery of Colombia, we also have the electricity and low carbon that has attracted the interest of governments such as in Colombia and Mexico. And the Chilean government also has an ambitious strategy to develop green hydrogen with a lot of public investment related to that. We have around $3 billion in the region when we talk about sustainable recovery according to our definition. I would also like to take the chance to focus on another tool created by the agency, which is the Tracking Clean Energy Progress. It's an annual thing that looks at 46 sectors and types of energy, tries to find keys for the energy transition. And what it does is to measure the progress in comparison with the net zero emissions of the agency. And the comparison is quite brutal, because we see that only 2 technologies are on the road to achieve the target globally. If we go back to sustainable recovery, another thing that we analyze is the impact of the current measures on the job market. And we see that the current measures allowed to create around 5 million jobs in the energy sector in these 3 years. And it could be much more. The recovery plan, the Sustainable Recovery Plan, had the goal of creating millions of jobs. And another thing that you can see here is the importance to provide training, because in this new economy that we call energy economy in the agency, there is a very high competition level. So we just have 2 slides left, but another conclusion of the tracker is the imbalance between the investments of the developed countries and the developing countries that we call MDs. What the first ones that we mentioned, the advanced economies, are over 10 times more than the other group in terms of sustainable recovery. With the new plan of the United States that has been voted upon, and if the plans in Japan and France come to reality, then there will be, in the second group, they will have reached the advised levels in their recovery level. But EMDs are only 20% of what's been advised. And this situation is due to many factors that you know very well, probably more than me. Among them is the difference between the groups of countries in terms of fiscal windows. But we find that it's a very worrisome situation because all of these scenarios show in a very clear way that to reach the net zero objective, it would mean a very high rise of the investments in the energy sector and with a priority in the EMDs. To give you an estimation of figures, we estimate that we will need $4 trillion in addition each year to reach that goal. And 2/3 of these investments have to occur. So to finish, this is a topic that the agency has been working a lot on. We aren't in the necessary path that we would need to be on to achieve net zero, and it's not enough. The plans are not enough to set us on this path. This year, that can be related to a rise in energy consumption, especially in Asia, represents the rebound. It means it is the biggest rebound in a year in history, which is something that we really have to worry about. So just to conclude, since I've already taken some time, we need to do more, and we need to focus investments in the developing countries and emerging countries. The thing of international solidarity, reforms for the investment area to be more open for international investors in these countries, that is fundamental. And with that, I'll finish. Thank you very much for the invitation and for your patience with the issues of the screen and my accent, etc. Thank you. Thank you, Blandine. It was a very concise presentation in the 10 minutes that were assigned, so thank you. There's already some questions in the chat. We're going to wait for all the presentations in order to consolidate the questions, since there can be repeated ones or it could be enriched by the panel. The rest of the colleagues that are here with us are very diverse. And so let's continue with the order that was foreseen in the brochure. Let's continue with Jorge Milanese from the Houston, Texas Consultancy Agency. And we're going to talk about consultancy on this aspect. And then we'll have Jorge Leon, where we have who represent VP, British Petroleum, with information and statistics that are useful, very useful for researchers and workers of all kinds in the sector. And lastly, Fabio Garcia is going to present Olade's perspective on the recovery after COVID or coming out of this junction. So you can see that we have international organizations, private consultancy services, and companies that are part of the energy sector to complete this overview. So go ahead, Jorge. Good morning, everyone. Thank you, González. Thank you, Olade, for the invitation to talk about some ideas in this very interesting panel. Blandine really set a high bar for everyone. Let's hope that we are at the level of Blandine's comments. Can you confirm that you hear me well and that you're seeing the presentation? Okay, so perfect. Let's move on then. As Gonzalo said, Sproul, as for the ones who don't know, it is a global consultancy firm that works with energy. We want to talk about a vision or propose a different point of view under which decarbonization in Latin America will follow a different path from the one that is established right now in North America and Europe, based mostly in the social reality, the energy reality, and the different possibilities of energy production in each of the countries of the region. So I want to start, and there's a lot of information in the slides that you will see here, but I want to point to 2 or 3 things. So before COVID and before the break that we had in 2020, the world was growing in the demand for petrol in around 1 million additional ones per year. So there was a break there with COVID to see if the demand would really increase again. It actually recovered quite well. So in some points of 2021, the demand was similar to what it was before COVID. We think that now it will recover to what it was before, probably by the beginning of 2022 or by mid-2022. The question that lingers is what's going to be the path? Is it going to be 1 million barrels per year in growth as it was, or if it will be less? We think that due to the different carbon initiatives and the trillion in investments per year that Blandine was mentioning, we think that the curve will not be the same again. You can see here that there are different scenarios, but in general, we are thinking of around 700,000 barrels in addition per year. So petrol will be less important in the energy mix, but it's still a source of energy that we will continue to see for a long time. So where is it coming from? Where is this fuel coming from? We see in this curve here how different regions provide those 100 million or more than 100 million barrels per day that the world requires at different prices. I want to highlight 2 points in this curve. The first one is biomass, biofuels, and that is the cheapest way to generate energy that the world has right now, especially Latin America. Here I want to talk about, for example, Brazil, that has signaled that it will have the capability in the following 5 years to produce more biogas than the amount of natural gas that it's importing every day from Bolivia, that is 25 million cubic meters. So this is a very important change for the region, for Brazil, for Bolivia, but it's a good example of how the generation of biomass can replace in a more natural way the use of hydrocarbon. And the other point in the curve that I want to highlight is this one here. This is Latin America. On average, Latin America can provide around $58 for each barrel of petrol, but it can be as low as 38 or as high as around $65 or $70 per barrel. So within the progression of the supply in the world, Latin America doesn't have the most favorable situation from a price standpoint, but it's still competitive and produces in general, and the region exports in a net way in relation to other regions. The other point that is interesting is to take a look at the other projects that are generated offshore in deep waters as well. There's been a break even that continues to be lower each time. Here we see some very important projects that have been developed in Brazil, but we also see the incorporation of Guyana in this, and it has a lower price than Brazil. So we can see that the region still has a chance and possibility of continuing to supply energy to the world in a cheap way. What happens with natural gas? In this slide, I would like to point out two different interesting points, which is on the left, the increase in capability for exporting LNG each year. And as you can see, it's been incrementing to twofold or even fourfold per day. This is very important because we all know that natural gas is a transition fuel in decarbonization, and we've seen, especially in Latin America, that LNG imports have become a critical factor for the energy needs of the region. For example, Brazil has incremented the import of LNG due to the droughts that it has had this year, and due to which the hydroelectric dams in Brazil are producing much less than before. But this is another point to take into account, that Latin America in general is quite rich in alternatives and variety of energy solutions. And it's very important to have all those tools in our toolbox. Here on the right, we see the export capability of the United States, how it's been growing and how much gas it has been exporting. There is a low point there due to the pandemic, but it has really recovered. And the provision is that in 2022, it probably won't lower again. It will continue to rise. The prices have been really talked about recently, and gas price is not an exception. It's $5-6 per million of BTU. It's just this point that you can see there in the graph. There are different scenarios, and probably during the winter in the northern hemisphere, the price will continue to rise. But I would like to highlight on this slide 2 points. The first one is what we're seeing here, the price in the Henry Hub, which is the mark for the price in the United States. If we look at the equivalent price in Europe, it's more than $20 per million. And this really makes us think, because countries and regions that don't have access or that don't have plenty of resources, such as natural gas, have to import and are paying 5 times or 4 times more than what it's paid in other countries of the region. So with this, I want to talk about different solutions for Latin America, because it's not just a matter of producing hydrocarbons. Latin America has a capability of capturing and using and storing CO2 in a very competitive way. It's a region that has been producing both gas and petrol for a long time. The reservoirs are very well known, and there are many opportunities to do this in different countries of the region. This is something that is just starting in the United States and Canada. It's just starting out. It's been done for a long time, but there are a few examples in Latin America and the Caribbean. And it's one of the aspects of factors that could add a great competitive level to the region in exports, not just for energy, but for other products as well. I would like to signal here Uruguay, which is a country that has more than 90% of electric energy generation, 94, 95% is renewable. And Uruguay is thinking about exporting meat associated to green bonus that is related to this renewable energy that Uruguay produces. Uruguay uses part of that energy locally and exports part as well, and therefore could use those green bonuses to the farming industry, which I think is something is very interesting and very imaginative. How is this sourcing, transport, and utilization, storage process done? So there is a lot of technology that has been developed. This is not Star Wars. This is absolutely available right now. And as I said, it's something that is being done in many different countries of the world. Transport is conventional transport via pipes, in the same way that it's done with natural gas. And pipelines of natural gas could also be reused for this utilization. There are different aspects here. The part of petrochemical area, also creating different synthetic things, for example, graphene, which is a completely synthetic material that is used as a base material, and then storage, which is what I was explaining in different ways. So storage is done in a gross way in 3 types of reservoirs. So reservoirs that produced gas or petrol before and are completely empty, salt formations, or aquifers. So saline aquifers underground that cannot be used for human consumption or industrial processes, and their CO2 can be inserted and it can be stored there. So all of these are available in the Americas region, and the region has to really see this and start to evaluate what it can do around these options. I would like to finish with just a thought. People who work with statistics say that you can relate 2 variables in any way, but I hope that the 2 variables that I'm showing here make sense for you. On the right graph, we can see the progression of the generation of energy in the world from the 1800s to our times, to 2000s. And you can see how there is a significant progression, which really rocketed from the 1900s onwards. But as I said before, there's also the fact that there's been diversification of the energy sources. And these are the different tools in the toolbox that I was talking about. On the left graph, which for me has been very revealing, is the diminishing of poverty in the world throughout times, also starting from 1800s to our time. When we talk about poverty, it's defined as a home that has an income of no more than $1.9 per day. As you can see, the world has, there is a drop of 20%, and then there's another one until the 2000s. And then after the 2000s and 2 times, it's decreased in about 30 or 35%. So for me, there is a direct relationship between energy availability and how poverty has decreased. And to come back to the beginning and what I said, I think that decarbonization in Latin America is going to be it's not going to be necessarily timely. We have the responsibility, the governments have the responsibility of seeing how to administer, how to manage the rich resources that we have underground, and we have to see how to use this and also use renewable energy for all the inhabitants of the region. So this is a last slide, just a reality check. This is the price of gas in San Francisco in California last weekend. So $5.85 a gallon. I'm in Houston. I pay $2.80. Sometimes we don't have to take a look at Europe to see all the asymmetries that occur regionally. And this is what happens in Latin America. Latin America, unfortunately, cannot absorb very high impacts of a surge in energy, and our responsibility is to continue to provide the availability of energy in the best way possible for the region. I hope that I was timely with my presentation. Thank you very much, Gonzalo. Thank you very much, Jorge Milanese. Your presentation was great, and also the set of data that are being mixed, the perspective of costs for hydrocarbon and also the prices of sales in different regions, and that need to substitute to open up the comparison with poverty and energy is also, I think, something very interesting. It's a very important concept. I think there is maybe some optimism in the type of dollar with which the families are being financed. I think that some time ago, a bit less than $2 was much more in terms of what a family could buy than now. And it's also very important to see how the life quality increases and what are the different accesses that people have nowadays and how it can be extended in the region in particular. So I'm still writing down the questions that are appearing. We'll leave them for the end. We'll see what we'll do with that in the end. And we'll have our other Jorge Leon from British Petroleum now. Remember to just do a brief introduction of yourselves, yourself, your institution, before proceeding with the presentation. Thank you very much, Jorge Leon. Good afternoon, everyone. Hello from London. My name is Jorge Leon. As I said, I am a consultant in BP. And before I worked in Vienna with consultancy for energy. And my idea is to try to take a look at how the world will evolve in the long term. I always start my presentation saying that figures in the scenarios that I'm going to show you in the following minutes are not going to happen because I cannot predict the future, and I think nobody can. So therefore, these scenarios are something that we make up in order to try to understand the uncertainty areas that we are facing in the energy transition. The energy outlook, which is a very known product of the industry, is we have three different scenarios. So we have business as usual, where we assume that it's going to have the same evolution as in the past. And there you can see that the CO2 emissions are just fall just a little bit until 2050. Then we have the scenario that has to do with maintaining the global temperature in 2 degrees. And as you can see in that scenario, the emissions have really dropped. And then the last one, which is the net zero scenario, which is also consistent with maintaining the temperature rise in just 1.5, and that would mean that the emissions would drop to 0 in 2050. I'm going to start the presentation saying that I can't predict the future. The figures that I'm going to show you and the data that I'm going to show you will not really happen. So what do I know about the future? Even though I've said that I don't know how to predict the future, I do know some things about the future. And I think that one way to answer about what we know about it is try to find common areas in these scenarios that are common for the three of them. And that would give us some certainty of how these things can really come to reality in a way or another. The first one is
The quota of fossil fuels, oil and carbon are falling and decreasing in these scenarios by 2050. So depending on the scenario, they could decrease by 20% or even more. And I don't know if by 2050, the quota of fossil fuels will be 42 or 44%. I don't know that. But what I do know, however, is that the quota of fossil fuels will definitely be lower than that which we have now in the present. The second feature is the feature of the growth of renewables. The global mix quota will be somewhere around 20 to 60% depending on the scenario. And the third thing is electricity. The world continues bringing in electricity. By 2018, this was close to 20%, and by 2050, that quota also increases. So this is data that is common for all scenarios, and this is something that I believe we will see in the future. Now, another thing that we could do to answer what does the future hold is consider what the world would look like based on this energy transition. So what would the world look like? And for that, I want to use the rapid scenario. For this, I am showing the quota of the global mix throughout the years. And there are two things that catch my attention here. The first thing is that for a large part of the modern history, the mix was dominated by one source. At the beginning, it was carbon, then we had oil, and now if we look towards the next 20, 25, 30 years, is that all energy sources are actively participating in this market. So we have a varied energy mix, much more varied than in the past. And this is important because this shows that the energy transition will be more driven by customers' choice rather than by the existence of certain types of fuels. So, for example, if there was a country that by 1930s I was a carbon producer, no one could compete with me. And then later on, if I was an oil producer, no one could compete with me. But now this is changing, and competition between the multiple sources is growing. And I also like to talk about what's going to happen in the future. But for that, I think it's necessary for us to look at what has been happening in the past few years pertaining to the energy transition. I will talk about the negative aspects, the positive aspects, and about what's to come. Pertaining to the negative aspects is that the median world temperature continues on the rise. Last year was the second warmest year in the history of humanity. Second, we know that the amount of extreme weather events has also considerably increased, as you can see in this graph. By 1980s, we had about 100 extreme weather events such as droughts, hurricanes, and forest fires. But in the last 20 years, we have about 300 or 350 extreme weather events a year. And then something else Blandine very clearly said, and this is data from the IEA, is that carbon emissions by 21% are seen to be on the rise by 4.8%, one of the greatest increases in history. But now let's go to the positive side of this. This graph shows the number of people that consider climate change is a threat for people. By 2013, only 55% thought that it did, and that percentage has increased by 2020. And we also ask people whether or not they're aware of climate change. And we can see that the awareness of climate change is really high. Over 50% of the people in our region are aware of climate change. And because they are aware of climate change, they consider it to be a serious threat. So we are at the forefront, if you will, with regards to our awareness of the importance of climate change. Also, the number of countries that have committed to net zero has increased. This is an updated chart, as a matter of fact. 137 countries have committed to reaching net zero in the next few years. Another important aspect is that companies also need to join the movement. 5,230 companies have also joined the Race to Net Zero program that seeks to reduce emissions by half by 2030 and eliminate them by 2030. And also, the sale of electrical automobiles has also rapidly increased. We see that by 2021, we have over 7 million electrical cars being sold a year, and that's an exponential increase. And another positive aspect to consider is that generation through removables amidst the global pandemic actually generated its peak. But there is still a very long road ahead of us. And this also goes along lines of what we heard from the IEA, and that's that the investment in clean energy in the last few years has reached $1 billion. And if we want to reach our goals, we need to double that investment. And if we want to get to 1.5 degrees Celsius, this needs to quadruple. So this actually shows the need to accelerate the investment in clean energies. And another thing that I want to highlight that shows that we have a long road ahead of us is that carbon generation has not decreased in the past few years. As a matter of fact, if we look at world carbon generation has not significantly decreased, even if we have seen an exponential growth in renewables. And that is because we need to not just rapidly grow renewables to eliminate the use of carbon in the energy electrical generation. That is what I wanted to share with you. I like it that presentations are short so that we have room for questions. So once again, thank you for inviting me. I think you're on mute. Thank you, Jorge. I think your presentations have been great. You are dealing with very interesting topics. You actually talked about risk perception. And you are mentioning how this energy demand may force chain to create an offer of new alternatives for our regional economies. Let us now move to the last speaker. On behalf of Olade, let us take a look at the energy prospects. So, Fabio Garcia, you have the floor. Thank you, Gonzalo. It is a pleasure to be here. I am Fabio Garcia and I'm representing Olade. Let me get started with the presentation. Every year, Olade publishes an energy report and an energy forecast for Latin America and the Caribbean that looks at how we believe the energy sector in the region will be evolving. This year, we focused on how the sector might grow, looking to the completion and achievement of certain goals, one of which is the RELAC initiative. Let me see if I can move my slides. Okay, perfect, I can. So as I was saying, among our goals, we want to meet the goals of the RELAC initiative for renewables in Latin America and the Caribbean that was proposed by Colombia and adhered to by many countries in the region, and also supported by the IDB, IRENA, and ALADE. And this initiative sets as a goal that by 2030, we should have at least 70% of penetration in the electrical generation mix of the region so that we can become carbon neutral. And on the other hand, looking towards the net zero scenario that recommends that if we want to keep global warming within the range of 1.5 to 2.0 degrees Celsius, we should reach 2050 with a net zero so that is carbon neutrality. We checked some articles and documents about this, and we can see that the IEA does present some landmarks for us to reach this net zero goal by 2050. And over here, we include some of these goals that we need to reach. Some can be immediately applied, and they tell us that by 2021, we should be expanding the exploitation of hydrocarbons and of mineral carbon. By 2030, 60% of global sales of cars should comprise electrical cars. By 2040, we would be reaching the full carbon neutrality of the electrical sector of the world. By 2035, 50% of heavyweight trucks should be electrical, and we would not be selling internal combustion automobiles as of 2035. By 2030, we should have installed about 1,020 gigawatts of annual additions for wind and sun centrals, and by 2050, close to 70% of global generations should be photovoltaic and wind electricity. So these are very ambitious challenges, of course, and countries, depending on their socioeconomic and energy conditions, might start reaching them as much as possible for them.
From the point of view of Latin America and the Caribbean, what could we do to contribute or reach that scenario of net zero in 2050? So here we have an article that was prepared by the IDB and the Black on how to reach zero emissions in Latin America and the Caribbean. Here we have 4 key recommendations. So producing electricity with zero carbon, right? And creating a massive deploy of renewable energies combined with flexibility of the network. Then to have a massive electrification and also of fuels that are low in carbon, such as hydrogen or biofuels produced in a sustainable way. Increasing the participation of public transport instead of private transport. And also something that is key is to preserve and regenerate natural resources of carbon, and so reducing deforestation and promoting reforestation and the restoration of other systems that are rich in carbon. So now, being in the scenarios proposed by Olade, we have 2. The first one is the reference scenario, which we called BAO, which is an evolution scenario because it's based on expansion policies of energy that we've had with the countries where there is already evidence of an energy transition. There is a greater participation of renewable energies. There is an increase of energy efficiency. And apart from this scenario, which would be the reference scenario, we have, or we propose in Olade, a scenario that is pro net zero. We don't call it just net zero. because it would be too ambitious of a scenario to just say net zero, because we would have to know the capability in now and in the future of the carbon emissions, and not just in the energy sector, but in all of the sectors. So as a premise for this scenario that we propose, the pro net zero, which would be to have the region be on the road towards that path and that objective for 2050, we would have a greater electrification of the final uses of energy, including transport, also a greater participation of motor biomass or liquid biofuels, greater energy efficiency for final uses, so greater use of solar, thermic energy in final use, and an accelerated penetration of renewable energies in the energy mix. So as we all know, due to the pandemic of COVID-19, there was an increase in the demand on energy. And all of the scenarios that we've seen until now, that our colleagues have presented, we've seen that there is this changing consumption. The vision that we have now, the general vision, is that this energy demand is going to recover after the pandemic. So this decrease will start to increase, and we would reach a 2% annual average rate in the region of Latin America. This would be part of the reference scenario. So if we look at sources, what will happen with the energy consumption? We see that in the bow scenario, yes, we have an increase in demand for hydrocarbons, but there is already a transition towards higher energy, higher electricity level, and we see that the electricity increase there, and there is also reduction in the biomass consumption, mainly because of the substitution of firewood. But in the pro-net zero scenario, we foresee that with the premises that we've seen before, we would reach stabilization of the consumption. And there we would have an increase, a higher increase of electricity use at the end. And there would also be a higher increase of biomass, but in this case, referring to biofuel. So here we can see it more evidently in these graphs, in these pie graphs, where we see the different participations. And we see that in the bow scenario, in the BAU, we have a maintenance of the consumption of petrol and its derivatives. We have a participation of natural gas as well that is constant, and mineral carbon is also constant. Biomass decreases, which is, as we said, because of the replacement of firewood consumption. But in the net zero scenario, we see that there is a decrease in the participation in 2050. Sorry. The same thing happens with natural gas. There is a lower level there, less participation. And what really has more participation is electricity and biomass. And let's see what happens with the installed electric capacity. So for the region to go towards a net zero scenario, we need to have more participation of renewable energies. And we see that in the BAU scenario, even though there is an increase of renewable energies and also in the same energy, however, the highest increase is in the use of natural gas.
And then in the net zero scenario, in the BAO scenario here, there is hydrocarbons dominance, but in the net zero scenario, the renewable sources that are non-conventional almost reach the same levels in participation of hydrocarbons. We can see this in the pie chart, where in the BAO scenario, there is an increase of renewable energies. We can see that it goes from 59% in 2019 up to 65% in 2030 and 66% by 2050. That is renewables for electric generation in installed capacity. However, in the net zero scenario, there is a clear increase of renewable energies that are non-conventional. We could move from 55 in 2019 to 86% by 2050, going through 71% by 2030. Right there, we will be fulfilling the RELAC goal, where it was stated to reach a minimum of 71% of participation. Then, if we have a look at the incremental install numbers for capacity in the BAO scenario, we can see predominance of new centrals by natural gas by 2030 and 2050. However, in the net zero scenario, the installation of natural gas stations is not as important as the installation of renewable energies, mainly non-conventional renewable energies such as wind, solar, and biomass, even though there is an increase of hydro compared to the BAO scenario. So when it comes to power generation, in the BAO scenario, as we have already mentioned, there is a clear transition and an increased participation of renewable energies. However, dominance is by fossil sources, hydrocarbons in this case. And in the net zero scenario, as it happened with installed capacity, we have a higher participation of renewable energies, and now they are the same as hydrocarbons. And we can see that even though in the BAO scenario we reached an amount by 2050 of required generation, that same number is increased in the net zero scenario due to the higher electrification. So there could be a higher requirement in the net zero scenario, both in capacity and in generation. And you can see that in these graphs for the BAO scenario, percentages don't change. There is a clear increase in the participation of renewable energies, but in the other cases, they stay the same. With this, there is an increase of renewable energies that goes from 57% in 2019 to 64% by 2030 and reaching 72% by 2050. However, in the net zero scenario, where renewable energies, especially non-conventional renewable energies, have a higher participation in the mix and they replace hydrocarbons, we can see that by 2030, we have already reached 70% of participation of renewable energies. That would be RELAC's goal, reaching then 83% by 2050. When it comes to the supply of energy, In the BAUS scenario, we have a clear dominance of hydrocarbons, especially oil and natural gas. We can see that there is, in fact, an increase of the participation of renewable energies, similar to what happens in electric generation. There is an increase, but it is also evident that there's a dominance of hydrocarbons. When we move to the pro-net zero, when it comes to energy supply, you can see that the use of renewable energies is higher than the supply of hydrocarbons. So in the BAUS scenario, we have 1,483 equivalent tons of oil by 2050, and we have a smaller amount by 2050 in pro-net zero. And that is thanks to energy efficiency that we achieve by electrification and uses, improving energy efficiency, and at the same time, increasing use of solar energy, and also to the increased use of direct energies in the generation of electricity, among others. So by doing this, we save in the energy offered in the region. We can see the percentages in the different scenarios. In the BAUS scenario, participation of hydrocarbons stay almost the same, even though there is an increase in renewable energies of the supply of energy from 26 to 28 and 30% by 2050. In the pro-net zero scenario, we move from 26 to 36% by 2030 and to 56% by 2050. And this is important because don't forget that in Latin America and the Caribbean is the region with the highest use of renewable energies. However, in this pro-net zero scenario, we could reach a renewable rates of energy higher than 50%. Lastly, when it comes to emissions in the BAUS scenario, there is an increase in emissions. When it comes to end consumption, it is clear that consumption of energy is going to be more involved in the result of CO2 emission, and in the pro-net zero, there is a decrease. Remember that I told you that the goal was not to reach net zero by 2050, but the milestone was to stabilize or reduce emissions of CO2, while at the same time having an increase in demand. And that decrease is shown here. This decrease by 2050, annual emissions will reach 14% less than those of 2019 and 14% less than those forecasted in the BAUS scenario. Final conclusions of this. We repeat that it was not the aim of this exercise to reach net zero by 2050. As we already told you, we need to know the absorption capacity. We need to know the emission of all the other anthropogenic activities. And what we saw that Latin America and the Caribbean should evolve to mass use of renewable energies so that in the mid and long term CO2 emissions stabilize or start going down. It's interesting that in order to reach this goal of the 70% of the RELAC initiative, and also to cover the increased demand of electricity that would result after increasing electrification of end uses, we would need 151,000 megawatts of additional energy in 10 years. And this equals approximately 90% of the current capacity in Brazil. And that is it almost doubles installed capacity in Mexico. So if we do this, that is what we need to improve all these results. In order to reduce 14% of CO2 emissions annually, we would have to install 823,000 megawatts of renewable capacity, and that equals the total installed capacity of Latin America and the Caribbean in 2019. In order to cover the demand of biofuels, we will need 80% of the current supply offer of hydrocarbons. That is a very interesting piece of information. And to reach zero emissions, we need to think about reducing anthropogenic emissions, but also it is important to increase the absorption capacity. And that's it. Let me know if you have any comments. Thank you very much. We're a little bit behind. This gives us a good panorama and a good outlook on two possible scenarios: electric generation and also the generation in kilowatts hour. It's going to be a challenge. There's another panel that is part of the Energy Week that will be talking about all the minerals that are needed for this. If we include those prospective studies in tons, we are facing huge challenges. So part of the answer here was on one of the slides of the International Energy Agency in your presentation when they talked about an increase in public transportation. So to change the mode, the way in which we live and how we use energy, so that we can make progress changing habits. And it's not only about replacing one energy for another. Just because we don't we have all the cars using electricity, that may reduce the demand for oil, but that is not enough. We need to change the infrastructure of our cities. I think that there has been a high concentration of some aspects related to source replacement, electricity mainly, and now in the post-COVID times and the requirements for energy transition, we need to face some other challenges, just as job creation, how to create new jobs with these new alternatives. These are challenges that remain. We have questions and comments. I would like that, please, if you're interested, maybe you can go through the questions and make some final comments. There were some specific questions for Jorge Milanesi, people asking about investment for biogas that is increasing a lot in Brazil. Some other specific question for Blondin about energy efficiency and the importance of buildings. Also, reflections about investment. What do we mean about investment for emerging economies, basically in our region? Who's going to finance those requirements? That is one of the other aspects. A part of this, taking that into account to reduce emissions. And we can also say that we're only talking about the energy sector, and all the other sectors that have emissions of CO2 are also facing their own challenges that may be even greater. than our sector. That is just an overview of the comments made, people interested in discussing about renewable alternatives that go beyond about energy and power and cost. Jorge Milanese, just I give you 3 minutes for you to tell us about your impressions. Jorge, you have the floor. Yeah, one of the questions was about urban agriculture. I think it's a very interesting question. The highest impact that we've had with urban agriculture is not about biomass production, but in CO2 capture. When we implemented methods, for instance, having, I don't know, growing plants on the facade of the buildings in Europe, the net result is not the increase of biomass generation, but the fact is to increase a constant capture. I think it's a trend that is going to be increasing. We have several tools available in our toolbox. What we need to do is to make a smart use of each of those tools according to the characteristics and features of the realities of our countries. And an additional point about this when it comes to funding, it sounds like a lot of money. Blandin said $3 billion per year during the next 10 years. And it looks like something astronomical, but it's not that much money. The addition of all the portfolios of the banks in Latin America, it's way more than $3 billion. We do have money available, but the thing is that who is going to make that funding? Who's going to be funding those investments? And what is going to be the return on investment and private investment and investments that are not coming from the government or from multilateral agencies? Those will need to have a rate that promotes or that motivates investors to invest in those ideas or opportunities. I think that is part of the challenge, and that's why I suggested that we have to continue or to develop our own path for decarbonization in Latin America and the Caribbean, because it represents the addition of all these factors, and that addition of all those factors will provide the final solution. Job creation is also fundamental for all this. We need to have net zero when it comes to employment, so it is attractive for the society. Fortunately, Latin America, it's in a good position. As Fabio was saying, Latin America has more than 50% use of renewable energies. I think that Suriname is a net zero right now. So I think that from that standpoint, we need to be intelligent, and being intelligent in the way we implement these solutions and how to get where we want to get. You mentioned electric vehicles, and maybe that is not the solution for Latin America. Maybe we find, or we have, or we need another solution. Maybe it works all right in North America, where public transport is not so well developed as in Latin America, but in our continent, maybe electric cars follow some other path. Yeah, Jorge, you're right. We need to look at our resources. Urbanization in Latin America, it's very important. People are asking questions about Venezuela because their income for hydrocarbon sale, they're going through an energy crisis. Bolivia is also having some issues. I think there is something in common. We are supported by natural resources, and we need to increase the productive capacity, labor. We need to work with those elements. We need to focus on that jigsaw puzzle. It's not only replacing one energy with another energy. Fabio, let's hear your closing remarks. if you want to make comments about the emphasis on electric power or some other elements that you consider relevant of this transition. So, Fabio. Yeah, I think it's important to consider that even though required capacities for electric generation are very important, and investment is also significant. I believe that its consumption is the one responsible for emissions, and the end consumption, we have several strategies that can be used. For instance, energy efficiency, so we need to consider all the potential that we have to reduce energy demand. Also, as we said, replace private transport with public transport. We don't need to go to a complete electrification of vehicles or private vehicles, but to have a transition to hybrid vehicles, and these hybrid vehicles that are more efficient than conventional vehicles can use biofuels instead of fossil fuels. So we have better alternatives for renewable energies.
Muchas gracias, Fabio. Bueno,
okay, thank you very much, Fabio. Karina, I could finish right now because we're a little bit behind. So I would like to thank you all. I would like to thank all the panelists, and then to ask Olade that please share the presentations because they are very interesting for us. Let's see if we can share that material that is so interesting. Thank you very much. I would like to thank the audience. We know that we have people watching this through Zoom and through YouTube. There's a lot more to discuss. Bye-bye and thank you. Thank you very much. We would like to thank our panelists on this green recovery post-COVID. We would like to invite you all to join us again at 2 p.m. Quito time, our first roundtable about critical minerals for energy transition, and roundtable number 2 on challenges and action for electric coverage in Haiti. Thank you very much. See you in the afternoon.